Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Chapter 1. The Affairs of the Family of Dashwood. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Norland Park, Sussex. Mr. Henry Dashwood lived with his only son, as his wife had passed away. She had had a large fortune, and when she died, she left it all to her son, but with one condition. The money and house would only be passed on to her son once her husband had died as well. After several years, Mr. Henry Dashwood married again, and had 3 daughters. His new lady had no money at all, and he understood that, to his daughters, he would not be able to leave much on his death. Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret would only get what Mr. Dashwood would manage to save during his lifetime, as he could give them nothing from his first wife's fortune. But Mr. Dashwood was a cheerful man, and hoped to live many years, and by living economically he would be able to save enough money so that his daughters would have reasonable incomes. Also, he hoped his eldest son would help his half-sisters if such help was needed. When his eldest daughter, Eleanor, was only 19, Mr. Henry Dashwood suddenly became very ill and died within 2 months, leaving to his widow and daughters only £10,000. His son was sent for as soon as the danger was known, and Mr. Dashwood's last words were to ask him to help his stepmother and sisters. The son, Mr. John Dashwood, was not a bad person, unless to be rather selfish and rather cold-hearted is to be bad. In fact, had he married a nicer woman, he might have been made a nice person himself. Unfortunately, Fanny Ferrers, who he married, was even more narrow-minded and selfish than he. Consequently, during their marriage, her husband, who was very fond of her, had been made a strong caricature of his earlier self. When his father was dying, Mr. John Dashwood promised to do everything in his power to make his stepmother and sisters comfortable. After his father's death, he had to consider how much everything really was. At first, he thought he could give them £1,000 each. Yes, I could spare the sum very easily, he thought to himself. But his wife did not see it in the same light. To take £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little son would be making him almost poor. How could he rob his child of so large a sum, and then to give it to his half-sisters? "It was my last promise to my father, my dear Fanny," her husband replied. "He begged me to do something for my sisters and their mother after his death." "Well, then let something be done for them, but that something need not be £3,000. "I would not like them to think mean of me, you know," added Mr. Dashwood. "There's no knowing what they might expect, but the real question is what you can afford," said the lady. "To my mind, they need no more money. They may live very comfortably on the £10,000 they've been left." "That's true." Mr. Dashwood brightened up. "Perhaps, then, it would be better to do something for their mother while she lives. £100 a year would make them very comfortable." "Undoubtedly," answered the lady. "But if Mrs. Dashwood lives another 15 years, we shall be ruined." "15 years! But, my dear Fanny," exclaimed Mr. Dashwood in horror. "Well, my experience is that people seem to live for ever if there is money to be paid them," said Mrs. Dashwood calmly. "Perhaps, then," said Mr. Dashwood after a moment's thought, "I should just help them from time to time, occasionally, whenever we can afford it." "Precisely, my dear," said the lady with satisfaction. "In fact, I think they may live so comfortably on their own money that they will be much more able to help you than you can them." and thus it was agreed that between them it would be absolutely unnecessary, if not highly improper, to do anything for the Miss Dashwoods or their mother. Soon after Mr. Henry Dashwood's funeral, Fanny Dashwood arrived at Norland Park with her servants, and made herself the mistress of the house, reducing Mrs. Henry Dashwood and her daughters to the status of her guests. Of course, she had the right to come. The house was now her husband's, but it was a most unkind behaviour to the four ladies who still needed peace after the death of their dear husband and father. Mrs. Henry Dashwood, the widow, who felt everything in double strength, whether it was joy or offence, wanted to leave the house as soon as she could. She immediately started to look for a new house for her and her daughters, inexpensive enough for her to afford it. The task was not easy, though, and in the meantime the ladies had to stay in Norland Park and put up with Fanny Dashwood. It was a little easier when Mr. Edward Ferrars, Fanny's brother, came to visit them. Edward was totally unlike his sister. He was a gentlemanly young man, kind-hearted and sensible, even if not very handsome. Mrs. Henry Dashwood soon noticed that he showed much interest in her elder daughter, Eleanor, and that Eleanor was beginning to fall in love with him too. "In a few months, my dear Marianne," she said to her younger daughter, who had just turned 17, "Eleanor will be happily married to Edward Ferrars." "But you do not look happy, my love," she added, as she saw Marianne's expression. "Don't you think him a good choice?" "Edward is," said Marianne with hesitation, "the most kind-hearted person in the world, but he has not the spirit which a young man ought to have. He is not lively enough, doesn't dance or sing well, and is hopeless at reading poetry. But, mamma," she exclaimed after a moment, "the more I know of the world, the more I am sure that I will never find a man who I can really love. I want so much." Such were the strong feelings of the mother and daughter, who were very like each other in the fact that they knew no limits in either their happiness or despair. Eleanor, however, did not share this characteristic. She was made very unhappy by her father's death and her sister-in-law's unkindness, but she could bear it, and tried to make the best of every situation. On the other hand, she could not be too enthusiastic about the prospect of marrying Edward Ferrars. Even though she saw his feelings for her, she knew not whether they were for love or friendship. Besides, she understood that there were other things and people to consider. Fanny and Fanny's mother, Mrs. Ferrars, would not be happy to see their eldest son and brother married to a woman with no money. And she was right. As soon as Fanny Dashwood noticed the interest that her brother showed in the eldest Miss Dashwood, she became even more impolite to her guests. One morning she mentioned quite directly how her brother shall be protected from any young girls who tried to marry him. Mrs. Henry Dashwood could bear it no longer, and replied that she and her daughters were moving out of Norland the next day, as that very morning she had received a letter which would make it possible. Chapter 2. In Devonshire. The letter was from Mrs. Dashwood's cousin, Sir John Middleton, from Devonshire. It was a very friendly offer of a small cottage to rent in the closest neighbourhood of the Middletons' own residence, Barton Park. Barton College was its name, and it was there Mrs. Dashwood decided to move. Barton College turned out to be situated among very pretty hills. It was small but comfortable, and had a large garden round it. It needed some small changes, perhaps, but on the whole all the ladies were very pleased with their new home. The neighbours, too, appeared to be even more friendly than they expected. They soon met the whole party when they dined at Barton Park 2 days after their arrival. Sir John Middleton was a good-looking man, about 40. He was friendly, good-humoured, and determined to do anything in his power to make his cousins comfortable. His wife, Lady Middleton, was certainly very elegant and polite, but reserved and rather cold. In the evening, Marianne Dashwood was discovered to be musical, and was asked to play the piano. Sir John was loud in his admiration of her every song, and as loud in his conversation with others while every song lasted. Lady Middleton wondered how anybody could not pay their full attention to the music, and then asked Marianne to play a particular song which Marianne had just finished. Only Colonel Brandon, Sir John's friend and neighbour, listened to her with attention, and Marianne respected him for it. The only person who noticed this attention was Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings, an elderly lady who talked a great deal, seemed very happy and rather vulgar. She was full of jokes on the subject of lovers, and soon announced that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne Dashwood. Marianne found this accusation absurd, as Colonel Brandon was on the wrong side of 35, and even though not without charm, was not Marianne's type in the least. When the Miss Dashwoods talked about it with their mother when finally back home, Marianne exclaimed, "But, mamma, he is old enough to be my father. To be in love at his age! He was wearing a flannel waistcoat, and has surely got rheumatism." Mrs. Dashwood could not think a man 5 years younger than herself so very ancient, and Eleanor only said, laughing, "Perhaps 35 and 17 should have nothing to do with marriage altogether." The countryside around Barton College was so pretty it invited the ladies for walks in all weather. One day, however, a particularly windy day, the youngest Miss Dashwoods, Marianne and Margaret, found it impossible to persuade their elder sister to join them for a walk, and so they went on their own. They pushed their way through the wind for about 20 minutes, and just as they found themselves on top of the hill behind their house, heavy rain began to fall. Wet through within minutes, they decided to run back home at all possible speed. They set off, but halfway down the hill Marianne fell down with a strong pain in her ankle, while Margaret could not stop herself earlier than at the bottom of the hill. A gentleman with a gun was passing within a few yards of Marianne when the accident had happened. When he saw that the lady could not raise herself, he ran up to her, took her up in his arms, carried her home, and seated her on a chair in the dining-room. Eleanor and Mrs. Dashwood had been standing speechless, staring at the strikingly handsome young man, who soon introduced himself as Mr. Willoughby of Allenham, and begged to be allowed to come the next day to ask after Miss Marianne's health. Sir John visited the cottage that afternoon, and on hearing the whole story exclaimed, "What? Willoughby is in the country? I shall ask him for dinner tomorrow." "You know him, then?" asked Mrs. Dashwood. "Of course I do. He's a very good kind of fellow. I remember last Christmas he danced from 8 till 4 in the morning, and was up again at 8 to ride the horses." "Was he?" exclaimed Marianne with delight. "That is what I like. That is what a young man ought to be." I see how it will be," laughed Sir John. "You'll love him now and never think of poor Brandon. But," he added, "he is as good a husband as one can catch, though he hasn't got much at present. But his cousin, an old lady, Miss Smith at Allenham, will leave him quite a fortune one day." Willoughby visited them the next day. He was welcomed with more than politeness, and so of the kindness of the Miss Dashwoods he could have no doubt. Of their personal charms he was soon convinced. Miss Eleanor Dashwood had a delicate complexion, a very pretty face, and an exceptionally graceful figure. Marianne was even prettier. She was taller than her sister, had dark eyes which shone beautifully in her pretty face when she talked about something with passion, and it was enough to mention any favourite amusement to engage her in a passionate conversation. Poetry, music, dance, all delighted her. Within an hour, Willoughby and Marianne found that their tastes were exactly the same. They liked everything in the same way, and shared the same enthusiasm about everything. "Well, Marianne," said Eleanor, laughing, as soon as Willoughby had left, "for one morning you've done very well. You've already found out what Mr. Willoughby's opinion is on every important subject." "Eleanor, is that fair?" asked Marianne. "Have I got so few ideas?" But I know what you mean. I've been too open, too frank. Had I only talked about the weather and the roads, you would not have said such a thing." Eleanor laughed, but said that she had only been joking. From that morning, Willoughby visited them every day. He talked to Marianne, played the piano and sang with her. Then they read and discussed their books. When Sir John threw a party, they danced together half the time, and when playing cards, he cheated himself and everyone around to let Marianne win. They became a standing joke for Mrs. Jennings, who delighted in a match between two such handsome young people. Colonel Brandon was therefore temporarily spared her wit, until one very pleasant morning. Chapter 3. The Visitors. It was the morning in which the whole party, including the Miss Dashwoods and Colonel Brandon, breakfasted at the park, and there received their morning post. There was a letter for Colonel Brandon. He opened it, read a few lines, got up, and said quickly, "I'm very sorry to have to leave such a lovely party, but a very important business calls me to London. I cannot lose 1 hour." And with this he left in a terrible hurry. Everybody wondered what the business could be, and Mrs. Jennings especially, as she took the greatest interest in her friend's affairs. The next day, Willoughby was invited to dine at the cottage. In the afternoon, Mrs. Dashwood, with Eleanor and Margaret, went to visit Lady Middleton, and Marianne decided to stay at home and get the dinner ready. When the ladies returned from their walk, they found Willoughby's carriage outside the house. As they went in, they saw Marianne crying and running upstairs, while Willoughby was standing by the fire looking very sad. "Willoughby, what is the matter?" asked Mrs. Dashwood. "I am unable to stay with you for dinner tonight," Willoughby answered slowly. "Mrs. Smith sends me on a very important business to London." "Oh!" exclaimed the ladies. "But," said Mrs. Dashwood cheerfully, "it cannot take you very long. When will you be back?" "I do not expect to be back within 12 months, said Willoughby. "Oh, it is useless," he added passionately. "I cannot stay any longer here, among such friends whose company I am not allowed to enjoy." With this he left. Marianne would have thought herself cold-hearted had she been able to sleep a minute that night, or the whole of the following next week. She ate nothing, did nothing, felt weak and cried most of the time, giving pain to all her family, who could not help her in any way. One day, Eleanor managed to persuade her at last to go for a walk. As they were starting to enjoy themselves, Marianne noticed a figure of a gentleman on horseback in the distance. "It is he! It is he!" she cried, and ran towards the figure. But it was not Willoughby. It was Edward Ferrars, and, fortunately for him, as he was at that moment the only person in the world who could have been excused for not being Willoughby, for in Marianne's eyes he was the equivalent of Willoughby for her elder sister. Edward was warmly welcomed at the cottage by Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters. He was asked to stay as long as he wished. He stayed for a week, during which time he was so involved in the whole carousel of dances and excursions organised by Sir John that he had not much time to enjoy the peace of the cottage and the company of his hosts. One day, however, they had a free afternoon and were drinking tea in the sitting-room. While pouring her tea, Edward's hand passed so close before Marianne's eyes that she noticed a ring of hair on one of his fingers. "I have not seen you wearing this ring before, Edward," she exclaimed. "Is this your sister's hair? I thought her hair was darker." There was a silence for a moment, and at first Edward seemed too embarrassed to answer. "Yes," he said at last, "it is Fanny's hair. It looks different in different light, you know." Both Eleanor and Marianne were at this moment sure that it was in fact Eleanor's hair. The difference between them was that what Marianne thought was a gift from her sister, Eleanor knew must have been stolen from her in one way or another, as she had never given her hair to anybody. Soon after that incident, Edward announced that he must leave them, preferably that very day. He did not know where or on what business, but still go he must. And he did go, leaving them all to wonder at the speed of his departure. Eleanor especially did not know what to think. She felt very strongly that Edward was in love with her as much as she was with him, but she also saw that there were some great obstacles to their happiness. Whatever the situation, however, to her sister's greatest amazement, Eleanor neither cried nor starved herself on Edward's departure. Quite the opposite. She tried to cheer up the rest of her family. Sir John tried to cheer them up too, and the best way to do that was, in his opinion, to bring them new visitors. Therefore, as soon as Mrs. Jennings' distant cousin from Exeter, the Miss Steeles, arrived at the park to stay for some 2 or 3 weeks with Lady Middleton, he lost no time to introduce them to the Miss Dashwoods. During dinner at Barton Park, Eleanor and Marianne had the opportunity to get to know the 2 young ladies and make up their minds about them. Miss Anne Steele was about 30, with a plain face, and seemed to be able to talk of nothing but admirers. Her younger sister, Lucy, was about 23, was much prettier and much cleverer than Anne. They were both poor relations of the Middletons, but were so skilful at pleasing everybody that hardly anybody could see through their tricks, and all loved to include them in their party. The Miss Steeles made sure that they admired each of Lady Middleton's dresses, and laughed at all Mrs. Jennings' jokes, and loved beyond anything to play with the spoiled children of anybody of fortune. In short, the Miss Dashwoods saw nothing nice about them, and would have preferred not to be acquainted with them at all. That, however, was not possible. Sir John was determined to make them best friends, and not a day could be spent without them having to visit each other on some purpose. One day, when they were all walking, Lucy separated Eleanor from the rest and asked her in a whisper, "I'm sure you will think that my question's a strange one, but do you know Mrs. Ferrars?" Eleanor did think the question a very strange one, but said calmly that she had never seen Mrs. Ferrars in her life. "Well, if I dare tell you all," said Lucy with a coquettish smile, "I may be one day very intimately known to Mrs. Ferrars." "Good heavens!" exclaimed Eleanor. "Are you acquainted with Mr. Robert Ferrars, Mrs. Ferrars's younger son?" "Mr. Robert Ferrars?" exclaimed Lucy in return. "Oh, no." Then she lowered her voice, and looking straight into Eleanor's eyes, she said, "I am engaged to Mr. Edward Ferrars, Mrs. Ferrars's eldest son and heir." Chapter 4. Great Disappointments. Eleanor turned white on hearing such news. "We have been engaged these 4 years," Lucy added in the same awful whisper. "I can see your surprise, but indeed no one apart from Anne has known anything about it till today. I may depend on your secrecy, Miss Dashwood, might I not?" "Of course," replied Eleanor, hardly knowing what she was saying. "But how did you meet?" "Oh, Edward was my uncle Mr. Pratt's student for some years. I am sure you know. It was there that we got to know each other. But now we see each other so rarely," Lucy added with tears in her eyes. "Edward says it breaks his heart." Lucy put her handkerchief to her eyes. "But when he visited us just before he came to see you 2 weeks ago, I gave him a ring of my hair," Lucy said with a proud smile, "and he said it made him a lot happier." Eleanor turned even whiter at hearing this information. So it was Lucy's hair on Edward's finger and not her own. Back at home, Eleanor went through her conversation with Lucy once again. She was shocked and could hardly believe the information. She decided to talk to Lucy again and try to find out how much truth there was in the news. She had the opportunity the next day at an afternoon tea at Lady Middleton's. Marianne was playing the piano so passionately that Lucy and Eleanor, sitting behind it, could talk safely without being overheard. "Thank you for breaking the ice," said Lucy, as Eleanor seated herself next to her. "You cannot imagine how much it means to me to be able to talk to you about my secret." "Yes, I understand your situation must be difficult," said Eleanor as calmly as she could. "Everything depends on Edward's mother," said Lucy, "and I suspect Mrs. Ferrars will not be happy to find out her eldest son engaged to a penniless girl like myself. That is why we are keeping it a secret." "But how long can you go on like this?" asked Eleanor. "I do not know," Lucy answered with a sigh, "but I think it would be madness to marry now. What if Mrs. Ferrars disinherits Edward? We would be poor forever." Eleanor blushed at these words. So that would be Edward's future wife's main aim in life, to be rich. She needed Edward to be rich. "Edward is going to London in February, so he says in his letter," Lucy continued. "Are you going to London this winter, Miss Dashwood?" "Certainly not," said Eleanor, who at that moment would avoid meeting Edward at all costs. But Eleanor was wrong in her answer to Lucy, even though she did not know it at the time. Mrs. Jennings had a house in London, and to this house she decided to go after Christmas. And she invited the two elder Miss Dashwoods to go with her. Marianne was delighted. Willoughby was in London, and even though she thought Mrs. Jennings was the most vulgar woman in the world, she felt she could put up with her easily, if that was all that was needed to be closer to Willoughby. Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor, seeing how much Marianne had set her heart on going, could not refuse her. Eleanor decided to go with her, and as she counted on their visit to be over long before Edward's arrival in London, she felt it was a safe thing to do. They travelled for 3 days, and when they finally found themselves in Miss Jennings' comfortable house in Berkeley Street, they dreamt of nothing but burning fire and an early night. The next day, Marianne woke up full of expectations of seeing or hearing from Willoughby, but Willoughby did not come. They only had a visit from Colonel Brandon. "Oh, Colonel, I'm so glad to see you!" exclaimed Mrs. Jennings. "So, how did your mysterious business go? Come, come, let us have no secrets among friends." Colonel Brandon was very polite as usual, and answered every question of Mrs. Jennings without actually giving her any information on any subject. During the first week in London, the ladies were very busy visiting all of Mrs. Jennings' friends, and then hosting them in return at Berkeley Street. But to Marianne's great disappointment, they saw or heard nothing of Willoughby. Marianne wrote letters and notes to him, but none of them were answered. Instead, to her horror, Colonel Brandon visited them every day. And to make matters worse, by the end of the week, the Middletons came to stay at their house in Conduit Street, and the Miss Dashwoods were even busier. One evening, they absolutely had to accompany Lady Middleton at a very important ball. As soon as they entered the ballroom, Eleanor noticed Willoughby talking passionately to a young lady. He caught Eleanor's eye, but only nodded his head with cold politeness, without interrupting his conversation. Eleanor was shocked. When Marianne noticed him the next minute, and he still did not come, she exclaimed, "Good God! Willoughby, what is the meaning of this? Won't you come and shake hands with me?" Then he could not avoid them any more. He left his partner and came up to the two ladies. "Have you got my letters?" asked Marianne, giving him her hand. "Yes," he said coldly, barely touching her fingers. "I have had this pleasure." Then he turned around and went back to his partner. Soon afterwards they both left the room. "Eleanor," exclaimed Marianne, "take me home. I cannot stay a minute longer." Eleanor explained to Lady Middleton as best she could that her sister was feeling ill and that it was absolutely necessary to transport her back to Berkeley Street. Back at the house, Marianne spent another sleepless night. At dawn, Eleanor woke up to see her sister sitting by the window and writing a letter to Willoughby. The letter was sent, and within 2 hours, soon after breakfast, Marianne got a reply. It read as follows: "My dear Madame, I am very unhappy to hear that you felt offended by my behaviour yesterday, though I honestly do not know what impoliteness I committed. In any case, Please accept my apologies. I also learn that while in Devonshire I gave rise to some expectations which you will understand to be a mistake on your part. I am engaged and hope to be married within a short time. I gladly return all your letters, therefore, and send my sincere regards to Mrs. and Miss Dashwood. Yours sincerely, John Willoughby. Reading these lines, tears rose in Eleanor's eyes. She could hardly believe such cruelty. After she had reread the letter 10 times, she said, "Well, at least we know his character now, Marianne. Imagine your disappointment if the engagement had lasted years." "Engagement?" cried Marianne. "There has been no engagement. We were in love." Chapter 5. More Shocking Discoveries. Mrs. Jennings returned home from her morning shopping with a very sad face. She saw Eleanor downstairs and exclaimed, "How is she, my dear?" Eleanor only shook her head. "Ah," said Mrs. Jennings, sitting down, "he is going to be married very soon, and the lady, Miss Grey, has got £50,000, my dear. And they say he needs it very much too, as he is deep in debts. But say I, even if this is the case, he has used your sister terribly. To act as if you are in love with such a pretty girl, and then fly off because a richer girl is ready to have him." "I must say this, madame, Mr. Willoughby was not engaged to my sister." "No, my dear," exclaimed Mrs. Jennings, "do not try and defend him. I was in Devonshire with you, and I know what I am saying. A good-for-nothing fellow." Eleanor said no more, and Mrs. Jennings thought it better to leave the sisters on their own. In the meantime, she would visit the Middletons and communicate the terrible news to them. But as soon as she was gone, Colonel Brandon came in. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," he started hesitantly. "I'm glad to see you alone. I have something important to tell you. I hope it will help your sister." Eleanor understood him. "You have something to tell me about Mr. Willoughby? It will be the greatest kindness to Marianne if you could explain his behaviour." "I'm not sure I can do that, but, however, I once knew a lady very much like your sister, the same strong feelings and a great beauty too. She was an orphan, and we were brought up together. I cannot remember a time when I did not love Eliza, and when she did not love me. But she had a large fortune, and my father decided she would marry his heir, my elder brother, and not me. We were only 17, and we would have run away together, but they caught us and separated us for the next 5 years. I was made a soldier, and she was made to marry my brother, who did not even love her. My father died soon after their wedding, and after that my brother did not treat her well. Who can wonder that she fell? But he died too, after 5 years, and all his fortune, then very large, was left to me. I returned home and immediately started to look for Eliza, but I only found her first lover. How many others there were afterwards I did not even try to count. I finally found her at last, by accident, in a house for debtors. She was dying of consumption. She lived only 2 months, and then left her daughter, 3 years old at the time, to my care. I looked after little Eliza as best I could. She had a governess and private tutors. A year ago, however, when she was 16, I made a terrible mistake. I let her go to Bath, under the care of one of her friend's aunts. She disappeared. Nothing had been heard of her until that day at Barton Park, when I received a letter from her. "Good God!" exclaimed Eleanor. "Could this have been Willoughby?" "It was him," said the Colonel sadly. "I found her in London, 9 months pregnant and with no money at all. Willoughby left her without giving her his address or once writing to her. I moved back to the country, where she is now safe with her baby. Here he stopped, got up, and started to walk about the room. "And have you seen Mr. Willoughby since?" Eleanor asked, when he seemed calmer. "Yes, we have met with our pistols, I to punish him, he to defend himself, but as we are both still alive, not many people have heard of it." "Thank you," said Eleanor, shaking his hand as he was leaving. "It was most kind of you to tell me all of this. I shall pass it on to my sister as soon as possible." At first, Marianne could hardly believe any accusation against Willoughby. She was sure that the whole matter was some kind of conspiracy of London against her. However, when she heard Colonel Brandon's story, she had no hope left. She calmed down and decided to be calmly unhappy for the rest of her life. Her only wish was to go home. They wrote to their mother to ask for advice. Mrs. Dashwood, however, on thinking the matter over, decided it would be better for Marianne to stay among her friends in London than come back to Barton, where everything would remind her of her happy times with Willoughby. Her other wish was for her daughters to have some contact with their brother, who had just written to her and informed her about his going to London. Mrs. Dashwood did not forget his or her wife's unkindness, but still felt it was her duty to make sure that the relationship between all her husband's children was good. And so the Miss Dashwoods would stay another 2 or 3 weeks under the roof of Mrs. Jennings. Indeed, Mr. John Dashwood soon visited his sisters, mainly on purpose to be introduced to Mrs. Jennings, as he understood she was a woman of fortune. He was extremely polite to her. He only waited for the information that Colonel Brandon was equally rich to be just as polite to him. When he was sure of that, he could only congratulate his sisters on being able to move in such good circles. Soon the Dashwoods were acquainted with the Middletons too. Lady Middleton was delighted with Mrs. Fanny Dashwood, and Mrs. Fanny Dashwood found Lady Middleton the most charming woman in the whole of town. This caused no surprise to either Eleanor nor Marianne. But there were even worse visitors to put up with. The Miss Steeles arrived to keep the company of Lady Middleton, and Eleanor was sure she would hear from them very soon. She was not mistaken. They visited Berkeley Street the very next day with such incredibly good news that Marianne did not even want to stay in the room to hear it. It turned out, to Eleanor's horror, that the Dashwoods were giving dinner, to which everybody was invited, including them and Mrs. Jennings, Colonel Brandon, the Middletons, and the Miss Steeles as Lady Middleton's visitors. To top it all, the guest of honour of the party was to be Mrs. Fanny Dashwood's mother, Mrs. Ferrars. Fortunately for Eleanor, Lucy was sure that Edward, who had just arrived in London, would not come to the dinner. He did not want to be seen in the same room as Lucy, as he could not then hide his love for her. And so poor Lucy would have to face her future mother-in-law on her own. Chapter 6. Even more shocking discoveries. The day after the dinner, Lucy Steele went to see her dear Miss Dashwood to discuss the details of it. She hoped to see Eleanor greatly jealous of her success, as she had been clearly the favourite with both Mrs. Fanny Dashwood and Mrs. Ferrars throughout the evening. "Oh, Miss Dashwood," she started, "I can see that all my fears were unnecessary. Mrs. Ferrars was all kindness to me, was she not?" Eleanor nodded her head politely, but did not mention that Mrs. Ferrars was kind to Lucy only because she knew nothing about Lucy's engagement to Edward. In fact, though neither of the ladies knew it, Mrs. Ferrars had long been informed by her daughter that it was Eleanor who had once tried to catch Edward. Throughout the dinner, therefore, Mrs. Ferrars favoured Lucy, especially to show how much she disliked Eleanor. "And Mrs. Dashwood as well!" exclaimed Lucy. "I wonder that you have never mentioned what a sweet-tempered person she was." Eleanor had no reply to this, so Lucy continued triumphantly, "She must have really liked me from the start, to invite me and Anne to stay at her house as her guests for the whole of next week, and only after a day's acquaintance." And so Lucy was very sorry, but really had to go to leave her dear Miss Dashwood, because she would soon be so busy moving her things to Mrs. Fanny Dashwood's place in Harley Street. That did surprise Elinor greatly. She could not explain to herself why Fanny should show such favour to a girl she had only just met. The truth was, though again neither of the ladies could have guessed it, that the invitation to the Miss Steeles resulted from a conversation between Mrs. Dashwood and her husband. Mr. Dashwood suggested to his wife during the dinner that perhaps they should invite his sisters to stay with them at their house for some time while they were in London. Mrs. Dashwood was shocked. She panicked for a few seconds, looking for a suitable reply, and then found it. She said that she had just decided to invite the Miss Steeles to stay with them. They were such a nice kind of girl, and would probably not be in London the next year. The Miss Dashwoods they could always invite some other time. Mr. Dashwood immediately saw the necessity of inviting the Miss Steeles, and congratulated his wife on such a good idea. The triumph of Lucy was almost complete. During the course of the next week, Elinor heard from Mrs. Jennings, who knew all the gossip in town, that Mrs. Fanny Dashwood was so delighted with the Miss Steeles that she knew not how she would ever go on without them. One morning, however, changed it all. Mrs. Jennings came back from her early morning shopping with eyes so full of gossip that Elinor knew something very interesting must have happened. "Lord, my dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news? Mr. Edward Ferrars has been engaged these 4 years to my cousin, Lucy Steele. This was kept a great secret for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and neither your brother nor your sister-in-law have known anything about it until this morning. Poor Anne Steele popped it all out. Lord, she thinks to herself, they're all so fond of Lucy, surely they'll make no difficulty about it. So off she went to tell your sister about the whole matter. Lord, what a blow on her it was! She fell into such hysterics, and I must say this, Miss Dashwood, what she did was not polite. She said that Lucy and Anne could not stay a minute longer in her house. Your brother had to go on his knees to beg her to let them stay till they had packed their clothes. As I must say, Miss Dashwood," continued Miss Jennings, "I have no patience with your sister-in-law. What is this big deal about money and greatness? I am sure Mrs. Ferrars could, if she wanted, give them enough money for a cottage like yours, and they would want nothing. And I would help them too, with whatever I could." Elinor was not at all surprised at her sister-in-law's behaviour, as she felt less sorry for Lucy than Mrs. Jennings did. What she was most interested in was what Edward would do now, but this information Mrs. Jennings could not give her. It was soon given by Mr. John Dashwood, who came to visit them in the afternoon to talk about the shocking affair and demand their compassion for poor Fanny's nerves. "And Mrs. Ferrars's too," he added. "It cannot be described what she suffered on hearing the news. She sent for Edward immediately, and tried to persuade him to give up the engagement. And the power of her arguments! If he married the lady, Mrs. Ferrars would not give him a penny. She would give all his money to Robert, his younger brother. I know not what could be worse for a man than seeing his fortune in his younger brother's hands. What is more, Mrs. Ferrars would never see Edward again, but she would make sure he did not do well in any profession." "Good God!" exclaimed Marianne. "I can see what you mean, my dear sister," continued John. "Mrs. Ferrars is indeed one of the best mothers in the world, and only has her son's interest in mind. But Edward was so stubborn. He would not give up his engagement, whatever its costs." "Then," exclaimed Mrs. Jennings, "he has acted like an honest man." John Dashwood, very shocked to hear such words, soon left. The 3 ladies remained of the same opinion as to the behaviour of Edward and his family. They felt sorry for Edward, and knew not how his situation could possibly be improved. But the help came much sooner than anyone could have expected, and from a most unlikely person. The next morning brought Colonel Brandon to Berkeley Street. He came on purpose to talk about a very important matter to Miss Dashwood. "I understand," he started, Mr. Ferrers to be your good friend?" Eleanor nodded her head. "I have heard about the cruelty of his family. I know myself the unhappiness of being divided from the person one loves, and I have come to help Mr. Ferrers as best I can." Eleanor looked at him in the greatest surprise, and listened again. "I understand Mr. Ferrers would like to become a clergyman, is that right?" Eleanor nodded her head again. "Well, the clergyman of my estate has just left it, and so it is free for Mr. Ferrers to take it whenever he likes. It is not a great fortune, about £200 a year, but it could be a start for the young couple. Miss Dashwood, would you be so kind as to inform Mr. Ferrers about it?" Eleanor nodded her head again, and thanked him with all her heart for this kindness toward Edward. Chapter 7. Explanations. Eleanor was about to start her letter to Edward when Edward came into the room. "I have come to say good-bye," he started, and it seemed the words were painful to him. "I am afraid we may not meet very soon." "And I have great news to tell you," said Eleanor, and then went on to tell him about the kind offer of Colonel Brandon. Edward's eyes grew bigger and bigger in surprise. "Colonel Brandon offers me all this? How did you manage to persuade him to do it?" "I did no such thing," protested Eleanor. "You owe it all to your gentlemanlike behaviour, Edward." "Oh, I have no doubt I owe it to you, to your goodness." Edward's eyes explained more than his words. They told Eleanor he loved her as much as he had always done, and that the situation he was now in was as difficult for him as it was for her. But no more words passed between them, and Edward left soon afterwards. The Miss Dashwoods had stayed in London for 2 months now, and to Marianne's great happiness they were starting on their journey home that day. It was going to take them about 2 weeks or so they were staying in Mrs. Jennings' other house at Cleveland for Easter. Colonel Brandon was keeping them company. While at Cleveland, Marianne hardly stayed indoors. She had missed the country air and beauty so much while in London that now she spent nearly all her time walking and admiring the views. But as she was still weak, hardly slept, and ate next to nothing, the long and tiring walks in wet boots soon resulted in a heavy cold, which grew more serious every day. At first, Eleanor saw nothing to worry about, but one night when Marianne's temperature was really high, even she got frightened. The doctor was sent for, came, looked serious, left some medicines, and said he would be back in the morning. But Marianne was not getting any better. She trembled, was white as a sheet, and kept calling her mother in a terrible voice. Mrs. Jennings was convinced that the poor girl was dying. Eleanor did not let herself think such thoughts, but decided to send a messenger to her mother to join them in Cleveland immediately. Colonel Brandon volunteered to be the messenger, and though it was in the middle of the night, he got on his horse and galloped to Barton College. It was then that Eleanor saw for the first time that Mrs. Jennings' first jokes about him being in love with Marianne had a grain of truth in them. His love must have grown during the time he had spent with them in London, and what Eleanor saw in his eyes now was the fear of losing a loved person again. First Eliza, now Marianne. The two sisters struggled through the night. Eleanor fought for Marianne's every breath and waited for her every heartbeat. At last, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, Marianne grew calmer and fell asleep. Her breath was more regular. Her heart seemed to be going back to its normal rhythm. Eleanor could not have been happier. She only waited for her mother to arrive so that she could tell her the good news. And then she heard horses outside. She ran downstairs and saw Willoughby. "How is she?" he cried. "Better," replied Eleanor. "Could you please leave this house now?" "Miss Dashwood, for a minute, please let me stay. I need to talk to you. I need to. If I can make you hate me a little less. Please let me explain." "Well, sir, be quick then." I am married now, and very rich, but not happy, Miss Dashwood. I had not known what love was till I realized I had lost your sister. Oh, what a scoundrel I was when you first met me! I admired Marianne's pretty face in Devonshire, but never thought of marrying her. I was poor, and she was poor. That was not a match for me. Sure, I would one day get Allenham, but when? I could not count on all that. Oh, what a cold-hearted character I was! But during the months we spent together, I grew so fond of your sister that I decided to marry her despite all this. We would have to wait till we get Allenham, I thought to myself. The day when I left you, I was going to ask for Marianne's hand, but something happened which stopped me. Mrs. Smith learnt about my affair with Colonel Brandon's relation, Eliza Williams. I need not explain it further. I am sure you know the details of it. Yes, replied Eleanor, and I do not know how you can possibly explain your behaviour to her. You left her knowing fully well she had no means of contacting you, no address, nothing. I did not know it, explained Willoughby, and stood up from his seat. Remember who you heard the story from. Because I was a scoundrel, must she be a saint? He started to walk about the room, trying to calm down. But anyway, he continued after a while, Mrs. Smith was really angry with me then. She said I would not leave Allenham or any money to me unless I married Eliza. This could not be. I had to leave, go to London and marry someone with a fortune. I had known Miss Grey, my present wife, before. I knew she would be ready to marry me, and this is what happened. And your letter, Mr. Willoughby? Asked Eleanor. How could you have written such a letter? Ha! You liked my wife's style of writing, then? Your wife's? Eleanor exclaimed. The letter was in your handwriting. Yes, but I only copied the sentences which my wife so charmingly put together. She had found Marianne's letters to me and got jealous. The letter was her revenge. He stopped, looked Eleanor in the eyes, and said with pain ringing in his voice, Will you tell it to your sister? Eleanor nodded her head, and Willoughby kissed her hand and left the house without another word. There was no end to Mrs. Dashwood's joy at finding both her daughters in much better health than she expected. Eleanor, did you know, she asked her when they were alone, that Colonel Brandon loves Marianne? He told me so himself when we were coming here. I hope she'll love him too, as I think he would be so much better for her than Willoughby. There was something about that man which I never liked, do you remember? Eleanor did not remember, but that was not important at the time. They were together again, and would soon be going home. Afterward. The Miss Dashwoods and their mother were sitting down to their dinner on a warm April afternoon when their servant came in with the news. I have just met Mrs. Ferrars as she was passing in her carriage. She sends her regards. As he saw the ladies' changed faces, he added, It was Miss Lucy Steele before, madam. She is married to Mr. Ferrars now. Yes, said Mrs. Dashwood, observing how white the faces of her two elder daughters were. Thank you, Thomas. Eleanor now learned the difference between expecting a painful event and experiencing it. For the first time in her life she felt she would not be able to stay calm a minute longer, and then she was forced to do so because Edward Ferras's figure appeared outside the house. He came in, was welcomed, and asked a few questions about the weather and the roads. There was a long silence, interrupted heroically by Eleanor, who asked, And how is Mrs. Ferrars? Is she waiting for you in the carriage? My mother? Said Edward with some surprise. I believe she is in London. I meant Mrs. Edward Ferrars. Perhaps you meant Mrs. Robert Ferrars, Edward said slowly. Mrs. Robert Ferrars? Repeated the ladies. It turned out that after it became clear that Mrs. Ferrars would not change her mind and indeed pass all Edward's money on to Robert, Lucy suddenly moved her affection to him, too. 2 weeks after the Miss Dashwoods had left London, she wrote a letter to Edward explaining that she was going to marry his younger brother, with whom she was greatly in love. Edward's engagement to Lucy was formed when Edward was very young and could not yet judge people better. But later, when he realized his mistake, it was too late, as Lucy seemed to be so much in love with him that he felt he could not break his word to her. He had never realized that she had been after his money all the time. At any rate, Edward was now free and came to Barton to ask for Eleanor's hand, which was what he had long wanted to do. It can be easily guessed what her reply was. Eleanor and Edward lived very happily in their small house next to Colonel Brandon's residence. It was not far from Barton College either. Their happiness increased even more when, after 2 years, Marianne moved to live with the Colonel as his wife. Neither Eleanor nor her mother had ever dared to suggest this marriage to her. Marianne simply started to gradually find Colonel Brandon a very good companion. His tastes in books and music turned out to be exceptionally good. She valued all his other opinions more and more. In time, she even forgave his flannel waistcoat. And as Marianne could never do anything by halves, she finally married the man whom she loved with all her heart.